Hello and welcome, everyone. We're so glad to have you here today for this evening's webinar, More Than a Building, the Settlement House's Cooperative Structure with Joyce Milambiling, brought to you by Village Preservation and East Village Community Coalition. My name is William Roca. I am the Director of Programming here at Village Preservation. Just going to do a quick introduction about Village Preservation. So we at Village Preservation have been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend the landmark and zoning protections, stop inappropriate development, while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods. We've secured landmark status for over 1,250 buildings and zoning protections for over 100 blocks. And we host 75 free programs like this throughout the year. So please go ahead, scan that QR code on the screen because we're not able to do this without your support from our members. We are a member-based organization and our programs cover the history, architecture, culture of Greenwich Village, East Village, and NoHo. And we look at everything from small businesses to independent cultural institutions, civil rights and social justice movements, artists, writers, musicals, dancers, all connected to our creative legacy of our neighborhoods and the unique built environment. So as I said, we are a member-based organization. For our members listening this evening, a big thank you to you. We really appreciate your support. If you haven't become a member yet, please do consider becoming a member by going ahead and scanning that QR code. Now, just for a little bit of Zoom protocol before I hand it over. So if you have any questions for the speaker, please go ahead, put those into the Q&A button there at the bottom of your screen. We're going to be collecting those questions throughout this evening's program and then passing them on to Joyce. We'll be asking them on your behalf to Joyce after she completes her presentation. And if you want right now, please go ahead in the chat, go ahead and just say hello, where you're tuning in from. We love to know where all our folks are coming in and joining us from this evening. But now I'm going to hand it over to our partner, the Executive Director, Laura Sewell at East Village Community Coalition, and she will then also introduce this evening's speaker.
Thank you very much, William. Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Sewell. I'm the director of the East Village Community Coalition. We work with our friends here at Village Preservation on preservation issues in our neighborhood, highlighting and supporting the architectural and cultural history of our neighborhood, which, as we know, is very rich. We also work on civic engagement, sustainability, and supporting small businesses. I met Joyce because my office is right here in the Christodora. And I first met Joyce when she called me out of the blue. We're trying to figure out exactly when. We think 2019, but it was in the before times. And she called me because she had discovered some fascinating correspondence between Christina McCall, who founded the Christodora Settlement House in its many iterations, and her clients. And it was just such a fascinating story. I was really drawn in. And over the years, I've become friends with Joyce as she's done more research on this and has now managed to publish a book, which is amazing. So you're in for a treat. She's a very engaging and talented speaker, as well as an in-depth researcher. So I'd like to introduce my friend, Joyce Milambiling, to tell you more.
Hi, I'm just appearing. I was smiling the whole time Laura was talking because sometimes it's like you can't believe that you've known someone for 4 or 5 years because the time just goes so quickly. I'm going to share my screen in a second. I just want to preview that my presentation, I don't know if all of you are very familiar with the settlement house movement. And so what I've done is I've done a little bit of a settlement house 101 for the first few slides. Then I go into my idea of a cooperative structure, which you'll understand after I talk about cooperation and structures. And then how Christodora House exemplified that, and not just Christodora House, but other settlement houses up to the present day. Okay, so I am going to share my screen. There we go. Okay, so as William said, it's called More Than a Building, the Settlement House as Cooperative Structure. So thanks for both of your introductions. I'm going to be using 3 guiding questions to focus and to structure the talk tonight. So first of all, what is a settlement house and what is and was done there? What is this idea of a cooperative structure and how does the settlement house fit that definition? And what are some ways in which such a structure has been illustrated by not only Christodora House, but also other settlement houses? And as Laura said, I have been doing research. I think my research has been since 2017, so about 6 years. And then when I got into it, I contacted Laura and other people in the community and realized that there needed to be a whole chapter on the environment, the area, the neighborhood around Tompkins Square Park, and then branched out beyond the East Village to what is historically known as the Lower East Side. So the settlement house in the New World was based on the Toynbee Hall settlement in England, which was quite a bit different from what developed in the US. The first one was by men for men, primarily university men. And then eventually women also had settlement houses in England. But in this country, it was more geared toward immigrants and having a place for immigrants to get services that otherwise they would never have gotten. And women were central to this endeavor. So the purpose, this comes from it was an early report in 1905 from Hartley House. Hartley House was founded the same year as Christodora in 1897. It's in what's it called? Hell's Kitchen. It's over on 46th Street, West 46th. And so the purpose is to not only have clubs and classes, but also provide opportunities that were sorely needed for recreation, especially for kids, to aid in what was considered at the time to be good citizenship, and also to provide places of residence for men and women who wanted to engage in this kind of social work. So the settlers were these mostly young people who possibly had graduated from college and wanted to do good in these neighborhoods. So settlement houses were and still are designed for families, children, and everybody else, workers and homeless, anybody else who needs their services, embedded in neighborhoods, founded on this interdependence. So it's not just something being handed out or taken, it's actually people working together. And it was considered to be a bold social experiment because it was an experience and an experiment, because these people would settle in the community and they would study the problems and the issues. And a lot of them had never been in those neighborhoods, let alone lived in them. And the settlement house provided a place where people could come for these different activities, for assistance, for learning. And one of the unique qualities of settlement houses was that each one was unique in the sense that they asked the neighbors, what do you need? Do you need help with housing? Do you need help finding a job? Do you have a doctor? Do you need dental care? That kind of thing. So this quote comes from a very good online source if you're interested in this topic or anything to do with the development and history of social work. It's the Social Welfare Library in the Virginia Commonwealth University. So one of the things that settlement houses have always provided as a safe haven for kids. And I have a couple of slides at the end that tell you the source of these different images I'm using, but I will refer to some of them as I go along so you know what you're looking at. So at the bottom here, two of these images, the ones in color, are present day. Okay, so it's the settlement house in East Harlem. The name is escaping me right this second, but and the one on the right is the music school settlement, which still exists and still is providing music. And then the middle one is Union Settlement. That's the one at the left. And the middle one is the Irene Kaufman Settlement House. That was a Jewish settlement house. And this particular photograph is from 1924. And it's a playground indoors. So some of the playgrounds were outdoors, but as you know, in New York City, space is at a premium. So if they had a building and they could put equipment in it, then they had a playground. Okay, so this is just a partial list of something of the things that settlement houses provide for kids. And settlement houses have always billed themselves as a place for everyone. This poster is in Yiddish and English, and it comes from there was this wonderful poster collection, the WPA project that was instituted by President Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, or the other one, FDR. And they did some amazing art, and there are a lot of posters that you can actually see at the Library of Congress actually has the collection. A lot of this is online. And then the Hamilton Madison House is where the exercise class is happening. So you can see something written in Chinese at the back. And the ladies are very active. And so I've added a few things that have been more in the present rather than the past. For example, legal assistance, even though legal assistance was always provided in some settlement houses, that's something that a lot of immigrants need these days. So immigrants are definitely some of the clients that avail themselves of settlement house resources these days, and also senior services and bringing food to people who are shut-ins or who are cannot get out of their houses. And during COVID, settlement houses were at the forefront of providing the kinds of things that people needed, especially people who had never really had to avail themselves of these services before. So who were the settlers and what did they do? So they were not the immigrants. They were these people who lived in these houses, the neighborhoods, and they did whatever needed to be done. And so one of the important aspects was to connect across class lines, and not only to fulfill immediate needs, but also say what is needed in this neighborhood in the short and long term, and how do we fix some of these things. And so there were a lot of people who actually became these social and political advocates for the poor, for immigrants, for people who really didn't have a voice at the time. And of course, it still happens today. And some major accomplishments of the settlement house movement were effective child labor laws and school attendance policies. If they weren't in school, they were working. And so to try to get the kids to be in school, and some of these were fought, these policies, because the industries who required vast amounts of labor, they needed the kids and the adults, any people who could work in sweatshops or other places. Worker protection and rights legislation, and also health and municipal sanitation reform. One of the funny things about some of the early, I think Jane Addams was a garbage inspector, And Frances Perkins was a factory inspector and was the first female cabinet member under FDR. And so they often didn't plan on fulfilling these roles and doing these jobs, but it just naturally grew out of the needs of the community. So the 3 R's of the settlement house movement, they were often called settlement sociologists. The 3 R's are residency, research, and reform. And so the residency, they lived there, they did research, sometimes informal, sometimes formal, and they worked toward reform. And so these studies were often very systematic, very targeted, and focused a lot of times on the living and working conditions primarily of the urban poor. So now I'll switch gears a little bit and talk about cooperative structures. This is Jane Addams, and I'm going to read this quote because I think it's very articulate. And she said, when we seek a higher morality in our social relations, we must demand that the individual be willing to lose the sense of personal achievement and shall be content to realize his or her activity only in connection with the activity of the many. So Jane Addams is a beautiful portrait there that's in the National Portrait Gallery. She said that we're moving from an era of personal achievement to an era of cooperation. And that's one of the places where I got this idea that cooperation was very instrumental in the whole ethos of the settlement house movement. This is from Democracy and Social Ethics. She has some really powerful writings, and a lot of them now, since they're over 100 years old, you can find them very easily on Project Gutenberg online in their entirety. So structure, go back to Merriam-Webster. We think of structure often as a building, something that's constructed, like these poor souls on the left here who are putting up something somewhere. And also the plant. Plants are biological mechanisms, have a pattern of organization. And so we think of structure on a lot of different levels, but this is really what they have in common, is this pattern or this way of going about making a whole. So cooperative structures, I think this was in some of the advertising for this talk. Social settlements and community centers function as cooperative structures, and it's made up of all kinds of people. And the goals of all of these people is to reach some sort of make a project or get a law passed or some sort of end goal that's based in principles of equality and also social justice. And a lot of the leaders like Jane Addams, Lillian Wald, they were not only settlement house leaders, but they also were very involved in rights for all races. I mean, the idea that settlement houses were restricted. There were white ones and black ones, and there wasn't a lot of mingling at the time. Well, the NAACP, the initial impetus for that, several of the settlement house movement, women especially, were involved in helping to found the NAACP. So physical structures. Here are a few, 3 photos of settlement house buildings at different stages. The leftmost one is the University Settlement, and that was founded in 1886. Now this building comes from the, I'm pretty sure it's the New York Public Library. I've got it on one of the last slides. And there's not a date on it, but I'm pretty sure that this was right around when this building was erected, which was 1889. Okay, so 1886, first one in the country, University Settlement on Eldridge Street. The middle one is actually Christodora House, and it was at 145 and 147 Avenue B. The building on the right, so the one in the middle was sometime before 1928. The building at the right is the building that stands now in that same place. Those two buildings were knocked down. That this photo was taken in 1929, right after it was built, the year after. And Tompkins Square Park, which looks very different, is right across the street. And this photo on the right comes from the Museum of the City of New York. And that photo on the right, and possibly the one in the middle, but definitely the one on the right, is in my book. So the physical spaces used by settlement houses, speaking of Tompkins Square, the one on the right underneath the title there, that is Tompkins Square Park. It's a very innovative kind of seesaw where they're kind of hanging from it. So the physical spaces were not just these buildings, these big structures. They were definitely what people associated with the settlement houses, but there were other facilities, playgrounds, public park structures were and are. Okay, you still have these things happening outside of the settlement house buildings. Satellite campuses, so it could be in a particular neighborhood, there's a need for a job fair, for instance, or an art fair. Summer camps were a big one. This illustration on the left is actually Adirondack Camp for boys, which was not a settlement house camp, but I couldn't resist using that visual because I think it's so striking. Hartley House up today on 46th Street is the one on the right in the main part of this slide. And so it's important to realize that the physical spaces were very much a part of the settlement house, but they definitely didn't have to be permanent, and they didn't have to be someplace that everyone associated with that particular settlement house. So other aspects of the settlement house is cooperative structure. They are always an integral part of the neighborhood. They have and do coordinate with other organizations, nonprofits, religious nonprofit, I guess religious organizations are by definition nonprofit. But there was a difference in the whole idea of a settlement house to try to differentiate it from a mission whose purpose was to proselytize and to get more followers. The settlement house, even though there is a lot of controversy about how much proselytization was done, it's a tough word, and how much assimilation and Americanization was done, they really wanted to make sure that it was an open place that people felt welcome in and felt like they didn't have to leave their identities at the door. I'm reading Helen Hall's Unfinished Business book. It was published in 1971. She took over from Lillian Wald at Henry Street, and she has this section of this book called Anatomy of a Settlement. And I thought that was interesting because I had thought of the plant as an illustration of a structure, but also the body. And so she, under Anatomy of a Settlement, she had 15 categories, and I've just pulled a few of those. So settlement house, of course, residents, visitors, board, staff, that's what we normally think of when we think of the human element, right? Then many of them, Henry House, Christodora, had a playhouse where they put on dramatic productions, and often Christodora House had some really famous people come and have workshops and teach kids and adults different ideas and different skills like staging and stagecraft and things like that. And then some of the residents were actually Broadway actors, either working or not working. Many immigrants didn't couldn't go to a bank, didn't want to go to a bank, were not welcome in a bank. So they had credit unions, or they had buying clubs, and they had ways for people to borrow money. There were many of these sort of origin, so say Italian or people from different parts of Eastern Europe, who had their own associations that were associated maybe with where people came from, either the country or the region. But for those people who did not have that, the settlement houses often had a place where they could borrow money or save money or learn about fiscal responsibility. She also mentioned Helen Hall in her book, United Neighborhood Houses, which was established in 1919, still going strong. I think today there are 46 members, and 40 of those are in the different boroughs of New York City, and 6 of them are in other parts of New York. But I thought it was interesting that she thought of a settlement as this living organism, and she included so many. This is just not even half of what she included in her list. So Christodora House was founded in 1897, originally called the Young Women's Settlement, and it was one of many of the houses established at that time. This illustration is on the cover of my book. It's by this young, talented printmaker by the name of Diego Briseño. And you can interpret those shapes in the background any way you want. But the most interesting one I got from a woman I met in Florida back in February, and she said, "Well, of course, they're memories." Okay, so that was the most esoteric interpretation. But this is the 16-story building, and it looks like that today. You can walk through that particular door. I think there's a little artistic license being done in terms of different features, but that's the building. So Christodora House, as I said, all of the different settlement houses were unique, and Christodora was no exception. It was unique both in its character and in terms of its timeline. So as I said, it was founded as the Young Women's Settlement that changed their name the next year because they needed to branch out. It inhabited many different structures, both on Avenue B and elsewhere. So the original one was not at either 143, 145, or 147 Avenue B. It was down the street. And then they kept moving close by as they needed because of the demand. It was housed in this purpose-built building from 1928 to 1948. One of the features was that it contained a residence for young professionals. And that was, they thought they would be able to sustain themselves financially by having this residence on the upper floors, but it didn't work out that way. And eventually it was taken over in 1948. It was taken over by the city of New York. They were supposed to make it into a home for juvenile boys, or at least the place for programs for these kids. Didn't happen. Was abandoned, and it played, this particular building, okay, the 16-story, played a part in the gentrification riots and unrest in the 80s and at different points in the history of the East Village. And it still lives on, not as a settlement house, but as a foundation, Christodora Incorporated. And that organization still works with underserved youth, and their focus is on the environment and having students and young people learn about their connection and their responsibility toward the environment. And it's a very vital organization to this day. So Christina McCall was a very religious person. This is a portrait. I think this hangs in the office, Christodora's office. Now I haven't seen it in person, but I've seen pictures of it. And she was often not really confronted, but people were questioning, especially because of the name Christodora, right? Which means gift of Christ. Aren't you trying to just make Christians out of everybody who comes here? And this is a quote from a letter to a friend of hers. And she said, enough of God's love can make everyone live in harmony, each expressing the belief that is daily learned, he or she, from God. And she emphasized the common grounds, that was the important thing to emphasize and to bring people together and not emphasize their differences. The second quote comes from a principal. He was a principal of PS20 for about a decade. And then he went to different schools, was principal in different parts of the city. But this was a letter when she died in 1939. And this was a letter that he wrote. I did a lot of my research in the Rare Books and Manuscript Library at Columbia. And this letter is there. And he said that Miss McCall, everybody called her Miss McCall, was a marvelous builder, a builder of souls, and that the bricks she built were thousands of human beings. And so that also kind of goes into this idea of a structure. And in this case, people are part of the makeup of the structure. Whoops, I'm going back. So the settlement house, sorry, I'm going to go back a little bit. My laptop has a very sensitive trigger finger. Okay. Sorry, let me just do one more. I want to go back and make sure that so we've got Christine McCall. All right. Now I'm going to keep my finger off of there. So a lesson that can be learned from this is that there are always people who listen to others and to respond to the current needs of human beings, either people very much like themselves or different from themselves. And they work in these cooperative structures like settlement houses, and they not only work with current problems, they also anticipate future ones, and not just problems, but also situations. And so the idea that settlement houses were so involved in responding to the epidemic, we know and have learned lessons about what we might or might not do in the future if something similar happens, or these ongoing crises, that we can't always just think of fixes for now. We have to look forward. And settlement houses are just as vital today as they were in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And this is if you go to the website of the university settlement, this was there last time that I looked. It's probably been updated, but I love this quote, that settlement houses have never been more relevant, that the model evolves and remains evergreen, and that history not only informs us, but we can learn from it, but we don't have to be bound by it, and we should honor it. And then the idea of change. Neighborhoods change daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, decade by decade. And as always, settlement houses have always counted on the neighbors to shape their work. And then that telescopes out to shape public policy and helping communities become better. So I would like to thank the EVCC, Laura, and everybody there, and Village Preservation, some of the staff I just met tonight, and those of you who joined us tonight. And the slides, since I actually am doing really well on time, the slides, the images come from everywhere. And what's so wonderful now about doing research online is you find things that you just didn't even know existed. And so the portrait of Jane Addams. I didn't know that there were portraits of some of these settlement house leaders. The American Museum of Natural History, I was just there a few weeks ago, and they have all of these really wonderful educational guides online that teachers or homeschoolers or kids can make use of. The New York Public Library digital collections has a lot of photographs, a lot of original manuscripts. As I said, Columbia University has this wonderful archive of original material. The last image that you saw is, and I'll go back to that, is called East Side, and that is by this wonderful artist. I used it in another presentation, and I just really didn't want to let go of it. And it just is such an evocative image of a quiet urban street. And I had never seen that before, and I was really happy to find it. So that is it. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm looking forward to answering your questions as well as I can.
There we go. Okay, thank you so much, Joyce. That was fantastic. All right, so we have a few questions for you. So one was Frances Perkins worked at Hartley House. Do you think her experience there had any influence on her when she worked on the New Deal under FDR?
Absolutely. And I gave a talk a few weeks ago at Barnard College and talked specifically about the Barnard College and the sister colleges, the people who were from those institutions who had graduated or taught. And she was one of them. And I can't off the top of my head tell you where she went to school, but she was one of those. And she actually witnessed firsthand the Triangle Fire in 1911. Saw people, who had jumped out of the windows, and that really influenced her. And so she was one of the people who worked really hard at making Hartley House a vital settlement house, and also she saw that all of this different program, like the needs for these programs, and that was one of the reasons that FDR chose her. So she was definitely just the first female cabinet member, and so she was definitely Hartley House. So she knew that these reforms had to happen. She put her, thank you, Mountain Holyoke, she put her energies into working at Hartley House, but also, as I said, influencing policy and making sure that policy address some of these needs.
And in your presentation, you mentioned a few of these settlement houses, but do you know about how many existed within New York City at the peak of these settlement houses until the present day, and where some of those were located?
The easy answer is a lot. The exact number, I would say, and I'm sure I've read these numbers more than once, but there were dozens. Okay, there were dozens, and the Lower East Side, they were all over the different boroughs. And then as people tended to go to Queens, the Bronx, Brooklyn, then their settlement houses, either satellites of the original ones or new ones, developed there. And so I think that the peak time was from 1885 to, in terms of them starting, to maybe around the First World War. But I would say that dozens of them, and the fact that 40 of them still exist in New York City tells you that it's something that still fills a need. And so there are places where you can get that information, but I think that dozens of them, and some of them have turned into and have evolved into community centers. So they're not all called or were originally called settlement houses. But the settlement house, the idea was that people would live there and work there. And now settlement houses, that's not the case. But often people who work in existing settlement houses live in the neighborhood. And often what's really fascinating is you read these accounts of people who were Bernard Warwick, W-A-R-A-C-H. He was somebody who used the services at Christodora House. His boys group met there, and then he became a social worker, and he developed I think it was the Jewish Home for the Aged. I think that was the original name of it, and he's written this book about this thick on what his influences were. And there's a whole chapter on settlement houses.
This is a great question. So settlement houses, and a few of the pictures you showed, the buildings go up. It's a vertical community, so a community being built in sort of a skyscraper. What was that people were visible to each other, so how did they create connection and community in that type of environment?
That is an interesting question. I think that one of the most significant, let's say, aspects of the settlement house was the open door, and the idea that people, in fact, there was one settlement house, and I can't remember, I think it was the college settlement, which was established after university settlement, where these young women came and they set up household and everything, and they were hanging out on the stoop, as people do in New York. And cops came by and thought they were ladies of the night, and offered for payment to have protection, and then found out that's not what they were there for. And so the idea was this openness, being out on the porch, being in the streets, being part of. There was this really wonderful vignette that I read about in the archives of a teacher. The people at Christodora found this teacher who was teaching her kids in the park, didn't have a room. And I actually taught ESL teachers for many years, and I can't tell you how many closets and corridors and different odd spaces, even in places like Iowa, where whatever space you can have for kids, especially the extra ones who need more support. And so they brought this teacher and her kids into the settlement house. And so I think that a presence in the neighborhood, even today, like I've worked with different people who now have organizations, nonprofits like Laura and Melissa at University Settlement, and they're always being greeted by people on the street, and someone comes through the door and their expertise is needed, or it's just this kind of idea that if you're going to do work in the community, you need to be in the community. So I think the answer to that question is that they recognize the early founders of these settlement houses and the people who were in on it at the beginning, like Frances Perkins and Lillian Wald, realized that the most important work that they could do would be to be on site. There is a wonderful photograph, I think the New York Public Library has it, of Lillian Wald had the Visiting Nurses Association. That's what she started, and then it developed into Henry Street. And there is a nurse that is walking across the roofs of some of these tenements to get from one place to the other. It was probably easier to be on the roof in some sense. And so I think that the idea that these people who were the settlers never would have developed those connections if they hadn't been living there. Not just, there were volunteers too who came and taught English or taught carpentry and then went home. But the ones who lived in the neighborhoods, a lot of them became social workers, became nurses, became public policy wonks, worked in different government organizations. Harry Hopkins, who has a plaque on the front of Christodora House. His first job was at Christodora House, and he was also instrumental, along with Francis Perkins, of developing and influencing what went into the New Deal.
Amazing. Do you know why the settlement houses fell out of fashion? And is it because the state took on more of those responsibilities in a formal way? And for those remaining settlement houses, especially here in New York, does the city offer any economic support to them?
Okay, that's many layered question. I think that the first part was, can you remind me again?
Why they fell out of fashion?
Okay, because they kind of, the professionalization of social work, for instance, was one reason. And also, it's not because that what they offered was not needed anymore, but you had people who realized that they could do some of that same work in different careers and organizations. And so the settlement house itself, there's one author who said that really they stopped being a thing in the 20s. I don't think that that's accurate at all, it's especially since we still have some. So I think that they were an idea that really fit the time when they developed, and still, like that quote that I used at the end, the idea hasn't died, that you need people working in communities. You've got all kinds of nonprofits on all levels. And so I know that working in a university for so long, people compete for the different grants that are available, either from private foundations, from the state, from the city, from the federal government. And so in that way, to answer the funding question, they're supported insofar as there are funds. And often these are competitive grants. A lot of people I know who work in nonprofits, 89% of their jobs is writing grants, and it's not, it's hard work, and then you might not get it. And so I think that there are a lot of, I write a little bit about philanthropy and philanthropists in my book, and there are still people like Harriet James and her husband who funded the building of that 16-story building, who will give big chunks of money for different, for the opera or for MoMA or whatever, but it's usually the little bits of money and the little grants that support a lot of these nonprofits. And people who work in those nonprofits can speak to that a lot more eloquently than I can. But it's that they're supported by individuals, by small donations, and also by other entities that think that their work is important.
Absolutely. What role are the current settlement houses playing in respect to helping the recent influx of immigrants here into New York City?
I think they're very, again, people who are in the trenches, can be a lot more detailed than I can, but I know that they're very involved still. And one of the things I was reading about, and I think this is Hamilton Madison House, where they have focused especially on mental health and on making sure that, because immigrants, my husband is an immigrant from the Philippines, and I know that a lot of times they're underemployed, if they're employed at all, underemployed for decades before they can actually get a foothold. And usually it's their children who end up doing that. And so I think that the idea of helping people with asylum and refugee, all of that paperwork. I think that settlement houses are involved in, in some aspect with that, and also getting jobs and being able to fill out paperwork and having multilingual staff who can actually answer questions in the native languages of the people, and the young people who come in who are from these families who now want to reach out and help people like who their parents were, right? And they're in a position to do that. So I think that they're very involved. Settlement houses, community centers, very involved. Here in Northeast Iowa, the Lutheran Social Services, when the Bosnian population came to this area, they were very involved in settling and providing resources. And so I know in New York City, the crisis never ends, right? With immigrants. And so the settlement houses, I'm sure, are at the forefront of many of the programs that are needed. And then, of course, these change as the needs of the immigrants change.
And in your presentation, you mentioned that the settlement houses were sometimes divided by race, but for Christodora House, when it first opened, was it welcoming of different people's residents from different races, such as Black citizens?
That's a tough one because I know that even the more visible settlement houses actually just turned away people of color. And Christodora, I know that there was actually one letter that I read of Chris that was written by Christina McCall, and and this was late. This was maybe, let's see, she died in 1939, so let's say in the 30s sometime, where she said we got our first Black camper. So it was a boy, young boy, who was, and she said, why not? It probably met with resistance. I'm sure it did by some people, but theoretically she was not opposed to it. But even in the 30s, it was rare. And then as time went on, I mean, think, the 60s, the civil rights movement did not kick in until the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. And so I know that there were some, there's the White Rose Mission in Harlem, existed until fairly recently. And that was founded by a Black woman for her Black clients, for her a lot of them young women who moved, who didn't have a place to live. A lot of the boarding houses, were founded by the local communities, whatever, white, Black, Hispanic, whatever. They wanted to make sure that the newcomers had a place. And so I think that they were late to the party, and they were late to accepting that part of it was societal, but sadly they did not provide, as far as my research goes, they didn't provide a beacon of acceptance, although some of the leaders, like I said, were instrumental in forming the NAACP and in having bridges between the races, between the different ethnic groups, but more could have been done, certainly.
Then we have another question here. Often the settlement house movement has been criticized for its inherent paternalism. So how do you answer that critique? And of course, that critique may not be relevant in today's context, but at least for in the past.
Well, let me just give a very concrete example. Like I said, Harry Hopkins has a plaque on the front of Christodora House, and it's a historic plaque, and it tells you he was one of the, he was at the forefront of social policy, worked under FDR. But the woman who worked there, who devoted her life for 30 years, there's nothing, right? So we're working at trying to remedy that and to get some concrete reminder. But it seems like in history, I love the phrasing herstory, okay, um, rather than just history. Uh, the women are overlooked in these important things. And Christina McCall was not somebody who traveled abroad. I mean, she traveled abroad before she was at Christodora, maybe a bit afterwards. But people like Jane Addams and Lillian Wald and these different people, they were very public figures. And the idea of paternalism being, so paternalism can mean either whatever sex you are, you look down on someone else, right? You look down, like, I'm better than you, I can tell you what to do, I know better. But paternalism is also a male domination, and that's one of the meanings. And so the idea is that women actually broke through some of that very early on through the settlement house movement. That they were, and I write about that in my book. I have there was a quote. Women married the settlement, men did not. So when they went in and founded these places and worked in these places, they were in it for the long haul. A lot of the men, like Harry Hopkins, used it as a stepping stone. And that's not to minimize or denigrate what he did. He did some wonderful things. But he was a white male, and he is recognized when you go into history books and read about settlement houses. Um, you will see Harry Hopkins' name all over the place, but you will not see Christina McCall's. So I think that it's like a double-edged sword. They did make inroads as far as females in public policy and positions of power in visibility, but at the same time, they were and still are often overshadowed by the males who do the same thing.
All right, and I think this will be our last question then. Do you anticipate extending your research on the settlement movement now that you've written this book? And if so, what comes next?
Well, it's interesting. You should ask. I'm a linguist. I taught linguistics and I taught language teachers for many, many years. And I found correspondence, not only the Christina McCall correspondence, but I found correspondence at the New York Historical Society between two women, and actually just one side of it from someone who studied English, who learned English at Christodora, and her teacher. So her letters, so her name was Helen Schechter. And actually, if you go to the New York Historical Society, there is a exhibit right now on women's work, and one of Helen Schechter's letters is there. And so I've researched, her life and the teacher's life, but the teachers' letters, nobody knows if they still exist, if they're still around. A lot of times, especially if it was a relationship between women and it was controversial, either it was a sexual relationship or romantic friendship, people asked that the letters be burned once they died. So what I want to do is I want to write the letters from the teacher to the student. We have the letters from the student to the teacher, but we don't have the replies. We don't have the original letters. So I want to venture more out of nonfiction into fiction and write the letters by the teacher. And we can only surmise what they said. So that's my next project.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much, Joyce, for your wonderful presentation. Before I let everybody go here for the evening, so first of all, a round of applause again for Joyce. That was so fantastic. Thank you. If you're interested in joining us here at Village Preservation this Thursday, and I have the incorrect date here, it should be October 12th, so apologies for that. It should be this Thursday, the 12th of October at 7 p.m. Please head over to villagepreservation.org, and we will have a presentation from T.R. Ravella Hamilton, the president of the American Country Home Association, and he will be presenting on Before Washington Square. And again, Even as Joyce answered in her answers here to questions, we are also a nonprofit and always are looking for support again. So please, we are a member-based organization. If you're interested in donating, please go ahead and scan that QR code. But once more, Joyce, a really big thank you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you, Laura, and the East Village Community Coalition for co-sponsoring this wonderful presentation. Everyone, you will be sent a follow-up email with the link to the recording from this evening's presentation. And please sign up for our upcoming programs. Thank you, and thank you so much, and good night, everyone.
Thank you.